Yeah, I mean, look, this is obviously the most controversial part of the bill, and it's the one that impacts on thousands of citizens in terms of their living standards in their retirement. So it is hugely important, and I have to say, like the other deputies, I don't accept the Minister's amendment addresses those concerns. I think it's inappropriate to be inserted in this legislation, and while you've attempted to address the issue of decisions being made unilaterally and without the consent of the employees, I would argue that actually some of the provisions that are there anyway to address some of the issues. You're at pains to kind of say that the problem is under the existing arrangement that the airport authorities have to replicate the IAS scheme. But really what you're saying is you don't want them to replicate the benefits of that scheme or the perceived benefits that employees thought they would get on their retirement. That's the problem really, not anything else, if you like. And that's precisely the problem that pensioners have, in that people had a reasonable expectation and paid over their working life into a scheme that gave them commitments that now there's a question mark over. And this is an attempt to corral them into accepting something less than what they thought they'd get, you know. So I just want to address maybe some of the points that you made in that regard. I think you are absolutely correct to spend most of the time in your contribution in terms of dealing with where we are, the crisis as it is, and the backdrop to this. But I don't think you've identified it correctly, what the root of that problem is. And if we're going to identify the solution, then we have to know what the problem that gave rise to it was in the first place. Now, you again reiterated that in your opinion, one of the key problems with the IAS scheme was what you called the lack of contributions on both sides. You said on the employer side and on the worker side. Again, I have to reject that notion. I think from the point of view of the employees, I'll make the point again, the contributions were set by an actuary. They were reviewed every couple of years as being sufficient to meet the requirements or the benefits as defined by the rules. People paid into that over decades. In the case of existing pensioners, they've suffered seven times the amount increased, but the employer's amount reduced. And the decisions that the employers took had a major, if you like, strain impact on this scheme, but the ones who are being asked to pay the price are the pensioners, the deferred pensioners, and indeed the active members at the moment, and they're still being asked to pay that price. And I think we should be quite cognizant of that, because it's not their fault, and I don't accept actually that it should be making the price, and I want to make some points in that regard. Just firstly, it is the case that this is the one occupational pension scheme that we're dealing with in law in this way, and I think that's dodgy. It would be my opinion that if the scheme presently wanted to cease contributions, which is one of your reasons given forward, then there's absolutely no reason why a rule amendment couldn't have been implemented, for example. And that this, in terms of the basis of the existing scheme. I mean, as we stand at the moment, there is a superannuation committee there in the IAS, but they're already been, if you like, overruled by trustees on things. So some of the things you say you're doing, you could do without bringing it in terms of the legislation that is there. I think one of the things that's been highlighted quite a lot, and correctly so, is, well, how did we really get to where we are in this scheme? And I think you were privy, and you would have seen the articles that appeared in the papers over the last period about the very poor financial decisions made by the trustees in relation to that schemes, and a big question mark over whether the deficit is in fact the deficit as they make out. And that's the basis being used to justify this. But is it really what they say it is? And I'm sure you would have seen the Sunday Business Post article last month, I think it was, which questioned the whole basis of the actuarial valuation in 2011. At that time, for example, and they highlighted to me, it was quite graphic, where they said the calculations in terms of how to deal with the funding of the scheme dealt with a situation where an average male in Aer Lingus was expected to live for 20 years after the age of 65, and a female 23 years. But in that had been the arrangement. In 2011, a couple of years after that, they massively changed that and added on an extra 6 years for both categories. Now, the question is put, how was it arbitrarily decided that pensioners were going to live 25% longer than was anticipated 3 or 4 years before that? Because the consequence of making that analysis and that actuarial change was to put on a €400 million liability onto the pension scheme, which hadn't been there before. So you have a huge multi-million problem caused by an actuarial assessment rather than actually anything else. You had on top of that as well interest rate calculations being used, which were quite low, which meant a higher liability and deficit expressed in monies. And I think the Business Post summed it up quite well, and I'd like to read it onto the record, because they're saying, in summary, the members of the airline's pension fund are faced with clear proposals to cut their benefits of between 10 and 50%, which are based on nebulous assumptions about future liabilities, ill-advised asset allocations, and a now questionable reallocation of assets into bonds at historically low interest rates. And they go on to say you're talking about 15,000 people and their families who had an expectation which is now threatened because of some of those decisions. And this is really serious stuff. Like, it's not sort of arbitrary assessments or calculations. You're talking about financial decisions being made by the trustees of the scheme that were at best bizarre. At worst, you'd have to question the motivation of some of them. And I mean, I mentioned some of them at second stage, but you had decisions being made where all of the assets of the IAS were disposed of. Their property portfolio was, in essence, dumped at a time when commercial property prices were escalating, and everybody knew that they were. And the property portfolio of the 5 Dublin properties, which they sold for 58 million, within less than 10 months had already shot up by over 10 million beyond what they'd sold them for previously. A rental income on that of 6 million every year. And, you know, questions have been asked about who are the beneficiaries of some of these decisions and some of the advisors, because the actuarial assessment that was done, that made some of these calculations, was done by Mercer's. And we do know that the chairman of the IASS trustee is also involved in Mercer's. We also know that that individual is and spent a long working life with Irish Life. So suddenly a decision was made to divest the portfolio of its valuable assets for way less than they should have been at a time when those assets were escalating in value, and instead to invest that money in Irish Life. 800 million tied up in incredibly low yield investment in Irish Life. I mean, it doesn't actually even make any sense that they would make such a decision like that. Why did they redirect cash from the sale of equities in commercial property to a low yield fixed income fund in Irish Life? That is potentially costing the pensioners, and who is going to pay for that? Because I don't think our job should be to amend legislation to, if you like, make up for bad financial decisions that were made on the backs of the pensioners. I mean, why did they sell a broad property, an equity portfolio, and tie it up in this low yield? Because what you're proposing now is out of that crisis. The pensioners and the deferreds pay for that in terms of their living standards. And we made the point, and you say that now the issue, they will have to be consulted, but the mechanisms for consultation haven't really been defined yet either. There was a lot of talk about how the deferred group were affected, but in actual fact, it's the pensioner group who's been the most excluded out of this entire process. I mean, the expert panel told them they couldn't talk to them, they wouldn't talk to them. There's not a single mention of the existing pensioners in the expert panel report. But let's look at what their contribution have been. They're the only ones who've actually had to put upfront monies back into the IASS to make up the deficit. They're losing about €40 a week from next January, nearly the same again. If the resolution to buy sovereign annuities is implemented, they're going to take a further cut, and this is on top of the cuts that they've already taken. I think we should be clear, when you talk and mention the figures of money that Aer Lingus and the DAA have agreed to put into the scheme, they actually haven't agreed to fund the deficit at all. There's no agreement to put money back into the IASS scheme. That's clear. They are actually not doing that. What they've done and what they're agreeing to do in the expert panel report is to set up separate individual funds to mitigate against future losses of the actives and of the deferreds. The funds belong to the individuals covered by that. So where are the pensioners? The 5,000 people who are already on a pension are excluded from this situation, and if we further enshrine this problem in legislation today, we're doubly excluding, because there's no fund set up to mitigate for the losses of pensioners. And they are being excluded and suffering. So, and there's nothing to stop the trustees from reducing the pensions further if they continue on the disastrous investment policy that they have embarked on and are still on, to be honest, and it's going to go on for years. So really, to be honest with you, your energy should be focused on addressing those issues if we want to help the pensioners there, rather than putting in a legislative provision at the moment which doesn't offer them anything really out of that situation. I mean, there are other points. Some of the amendments I have in are about just replicating existing clauses, say when the P&T broke up to protect people's pensions and pension expectations. But I suppose there's a fundamental conflict here, because your problem with this, with the measures we're putting forward, is that we are precisely trying to enshrine and protect the benefits of members, whereas you're trying to loosen that up in order to facilitate an erosion of those benefits. So I think there are a lot of the problems, and I think you should address maybe some of the financial problems that got us into this situation in the first place.
No, I think Deputy Daly indicated.
Yes, I just want to maybe respond to some of the points made by the Minister. I fully appreciate how my constituent feels about his desire to cease contributions to the scheme. I actually make contributions to that scheme myself, and I'm fully aware that it is a black hole for the active members of the scheme at the moment. In actual fact, what we put in now, based on the way it's been mishandled up to now, we wouldn't even get what we put in, not to mind to get what the company put in or anything else, based on the way things have been going. But you haven't explained or clarified the fact as to why this legislation is necessary in order to allow workers to cease their contributions, because my understanding clearly is that there's absolutely no reason why a rule amendment couldn't be implemented using the existing rules and structures of the IAS scheme without any legislative change whatsoever. So in actual fact, you don't need legislation to allow workers to cease their contributions, as you've suggested. You talk about how the freeze and de-risk strategy is necessary, if you like, to save the scheme, that this is going to point the way forward. But what you're doing is designed to give workers and pensioners certainty. But you have to ask yourself, what sort of certainty are you providing for people? Because the certainty we're saying at the moment is that for pensioners, they're going to be €40 a month worse off come January. And if this freeze and de-risk strategy and the returns that we're looking like getting continue, they're going to be cut even further than that. And there's nothing actually in this which stops. There's no fund to mitigate the losses for the pensioners, and there's nothing in it to stop the trustees from introducing further cuts on pensioners. So I don't think that's the type of certainty that people actually need going forward. You said that this is designed, that the schemes made decisions based on taking the risk away, and that's why some of the investment decisions were made. I have to put it to you that the facts do not back up that assertion, and you need to engage in some serious analysis of the financials of that scheme, because if you look at it, there was €667 million in equities, which they had, which they disposed of at a time when equity prices were rising. So that's not a strategy to take away risk. That's absolute lunacy. They had a property portfolio in Dublin, which you could not presently acquire anywhere. Such was the value of it. Prime property, such as the Passport Office across the road from us in Molesworth Street. Property which was given away at a very poor price on it from the point of view of the Aer Lingus shareholders. Great for the people buying it. And then you look at who buys it and who was involved in it. And that we know that those involved in it were organisations like Jones Lang and LaSalle, who operated on the one hand as property advisors to the IASS, selling agents to the IASS, valuations for the people who bought it, and then they themselves are located in offices which are going to be redeveloped in that building. And we don't think that's strange. Is it not strange that the trustee who decided to shore up 1.4 billion of Aer Lingus and DAA and other airport authority pensioners' money in Irish Life, very, very fixed income fund with a minuscule return on it, had worked in Irish Life for 30 years? Is that not strange that that decision was made? Well, I think that's strange because the returns on that have an average return of 1.27% per year. There's an annual management fee which comes out of that, so it reduces it even further. So that has tied up pensioners' fund and actually contributed to a huge risk. The other side of it is the remaining assets have been invested in sovereign bonds. And that's a huge problem as well, because the 15-year return on sovereign bonds actually is a negative. You're actually losing money by tying up your investment in that. It's absolute lunacy. And given the EU statements last week that interest rates are going to remain low for years to come, bond returns are going to remain low for years to come. And in contrast to that, we've the rising commercial properties, which they divested themselves of. So actually, the freeze and de-risk strategy has accumulated massive losses in that scheme, which are really endangering the living standards of pensioners at the moment, and it doesn't give certainty in that regard at all. And this bill doesn't address any of those things, and I actually think they're worthy enough of a separate investigation, to be honest. I mean, people would like to know, is the hundreds of euro, 800 million invested with Irish Life, is that insured? What was the return for it in 2013? What are the annual management fees being paid for that fund? Do the department know the answers to these? Because in actual fact, they're the real basis why there's a funding crisis there. And I know you ascertained there again that the scheme was unsustainable. I don't believe that it was unsustainable. I think some very poor decisions have contributed. Some really poor management decisions on behalf of the two employers who are left in that scheme certainly did contribute as well, allowing people to exit, putting a certain strain, not enough of an employer contribution in it. But it's still the workers, if you like, who are paying the price of all of that. In terms of your other point, that you need this legislation in order to allow those currently employed in the DAA and Shannon Airport who are not in a pension scheme to be able to be in a pension scheme. Again, I don't think that this legislation is necessary for that. If you take the case of Aer Lingus, for example, who have a new pension scheme for their new employees. They set up another company, if you like, Aer Lingus Ireland, I think it is, and those people are members of a defined contribution scheme. The reason why the new staff in the airport authorities are into the scheme is that they have chosen not to allow them to do so. It's not that there's any legislative impediment to that. I think the problem is that the benefits of a defined benefit scheme, they don't want to have that afforded to them. But why couldn't you have a scenario set up whereby, like Aer Lingus, they could set up a new scheme for new employees if they wanted to? What has that got to do with anybody who is already a member of the IAS scheme? And let's face it, this is what your amendment is about. It's about members of the IAS scheme. So if they want to set up a scheme for their workers who aren't members of that scheme, well, go ahead and do it. And if you need to bring in a piece of legislation that allows them to set up DAA Ireland or SAA Ireland or whatever is, go ahead. It doesn't need to impact on the IAS scheme itself.
Okay. I think you want just a brief supplementary, and then we'll go to Deputy Ellis and Deputy Dolan.
Thanks very much. Minister, as I said, that Section 32, which you're introducing, doesn't contain anything which wasn't previously in Section 32.